And welcome to the Sci-Fi Christian Book Reviews, brought to you by the Sci-Fi Christian.com. I'm Ben DeBono. Here today, not with a book review, but with my 2013 wrap-up video. I am going to give you my top 5 reads of 2013. Share with you maybe one or two reads that were disappointing or bad. I'm going to give you my worst read and my most disappointing read. A couple runners-up that didn't make the list, and maybe talk a little bit about what I'm hoping to read in 2014. So, without further ado, let's get to it. 2013 was a good year for reading. I think I didn't read quite as much as I have in previous years, more than in others, so average year in terms of amount that I read. But a really good year. I enjoyed doing some rereads, especially through audiobook form. I got into cycling this year, so as I was out doing some biking, I'd usually have an audiobook plugged in. I have like a little speaker thing for my bike or whatever, and that was great. I mean, it makes the time go by when you're out there on the bike. You know, as I started to do longer rides, I got some significant, got through significant portions of audiobooks, and so was able to do some great rereads that way. Really enjoyed starting these book reviews and being able to talk to you guys about what I've been reading, and you know, even if whether a review gets a lot of views or not very many at all, I enjoy you know, even for myself to think through my own thought process in terms of what I was reading, what I enjoyed or didn't enjoy about the book. So good year, very good year for reads. Here's hoping 2014 is just as good, and unlike 2013, I'll be able to have these reviews going on throughout the entire year. So in this case, because I didn't start until April, May, somewhere in there with doing these reviews, there's at least one item on my list, maybe two. I think there might be 2 items on my list that I didn't do a review of because they were too soon. But besides that, reviews of everything that's on here, including most of my runners-up, and I believe both my most disappointing and worst read of 2013. Just a note on criteria for how I am choosing these. First of all, I do read a lot that is not in the sci-fi, fantasy, horror genres. All of that I'm excluding, so you know, like I read theology, I read philosophy, stuff like that. Anything that doesn't fit in those categories, I am excluding from any of these lists. Second, for the most part, I am excluding rereads. There is one exception, and I'll explain why when I get to that one on my top 5 list. But for the most part, I'm excluding rereads, simply because, you know, it's like, okay, I read Game of Thrones this year. I love Game of Thrones, you know, but everybody knows that. So nobody needs to sit here and see me put it on a top 5 list. It just seems a little bit disingenuous. Which leads me to my third qualification, that these are reads not necessarily published in 2013, but that I read in 2013. Okay, so I only read a handful of books that were actually published in the last calendar year. But these are books that, for me, I've read for the first time, again with one exception, this last year. Some of them old, some of them new, so all over the map, but as long as it's something I read in 2013, it is qualified for this list. Alright, so let's get the bad stuff out of the way first, because, you know, for me, I love to read, and so I want to focus on what was enjoyable about my reading experiences in 2013. But not everything was, unfortunately. So starting with my most disappointing read of the year, I'm going to give this one to Dr. Sleep by Stephen King. For a couple of reasons. Well, I'll give you 3 main reasons why this was my most disappointing read of 2013. First of all, because I love Stephen King. I love his novels. I'm a big fan, you know, maybe not as big a fan as I was at 18 when I was devouring every single word he read. But I think Stephen King's a good author. Not always the deepest author, but I think he's a very good author. He's a very talented writer. And it seems like in recent years, he's maybe slipped a little bit in terms of quality. I thought Under the Dome was just awful. And I was hoping to see him get back to a good place with this novel. It's been a while. I haven't read his JFK book, though I do have it on my Kindle. I haven't read the most recent Dark Tower one, partly because Under the Dome was so bad that I didn't even want to check those out. It just kind of put me off Stephen King for a while. But being a big Stephen King fan, I had high hopes for this one, and it didn't deliver. Second, I had high hopes for it because it's a sequel to The Shining, and The Shining is, I don't know if I'd say it's my favorite Stephen King book, but I do think it's his most iconic. It's definitely his scariest book, well, maybe with the possible exception of It. But it's just a brilliant, brilliant novel. And I was nervous, about is he going to be able to pull off a sequel to The Shining? But also excited to see, what's it going to be like to revisit Danny and all that so many years later. And then the third reason I have this as my disappointing read is because it actually starts out really, really good. I felt like this novel started out very strong as it explores Danny's psychology, explores him as an alcoholic, as an adult, and then just kind of not falls apart, but just gets really dull as we move into the main plot with the mind vampires or whatever they were. It just gets boring. And that's a shame because it was such a good read at the beginning, and to see it just kind of peter off like that was really disappointing. So for all those reasons, I think I gave it 3 stars out of 5. Not a terrible read by any means. I think in my main review I said it was better than I had feared, but not as good as I'd hoped in terms of a sequel to The Shining, and that very much rings true. So not a terrible read, but definitely a disappointing one. So most disappointing read of 2013. The worst read of 2013. Well, if you've been following my reviews since the beginning, this one is not going to be a shock for you. 3001 The Final Odyssey by Arthur C. Clarke. I cannot tell you how much I hated this novel. If you go and watch the review, you will see me ranting and ranting and ranting about just how atrocious this book is. Warning, I do slip in a couple of bad words there because I was that mad about it, so, don't watch it with kids around. But I think that those bad words were certainly well-deserved in terms of describing this atrocious crap hole of a book. I mean, especially considering where the series starts. 2001, it's such a great book. And then, the next 2 aren't great, but they're okay. And then this one, it just falls off a cliff, and it's all the worst tendencies of Arthur C. Clarke. It's pretentious, it's insulting, it's stupid, it's boring. There is literally nothing to recommend about this book. I hated it so much. It really made me mad. Some things are fun to hate. This wasn't one of them because it was that bad. And because I do like Arthur C. Clarke and I like the series. I didn't want to see it end like this. But thank God it was The Final Odyssey and he didn't go on and write another one, because given the downward trajectory of this series, I can only imagine the depths he would have plummeted to in 6001 or 5001 or whatever that next book in this atrocious series would have been. So, very bad read. I will not be rereading that one anytime soon. Here's hoping there's nothing in 2014 that is nearly as bad. Okay, couple runners-up for you. The first runner-up is a runner-up not because it's a good book. It really isn't. Not because it's part of a good series. It really isn't. But it's a guilty pleasure, and it was fun to see the series come to a close. I'm talking, of course, about A Memory of Light, the final novel in the Wheel of Time series. If you're not a fan of the Wheel of Time series, don't bother starting. I can't recommend it. But if you are a fan, if you're somebody like me who'd been reading it for, 13, 14, 15 years, something like that, by the time this book came out, it's a fitting conclusion to the series. All of the series' normal problems are there in this book. Nothing revolutionary happens that's going to fix the many, many issues that this series had. But hey, for those of us who have come through whatever it was, 13, 14 books at this point for a Robert Jordan series, you gotta finish it. And I felt like it was a decent enough ending. It was a good ending. I enjoyed it for what it was within the series. I can't imagine ever rereading the series. I can't even claim that I'm necessarily glad that I did, but given what an important part of it of the series was in terms of my development as a fan of fantasy, you know, it's worthwhile to me on a personal level that way. I started reading the series when I was like 14 or 13 years old, something like that. So it's a series that's been with me for a very long time, and it means a lot to me on a personal level. Beyond that, I can't recommend it, but I'm glad I read it. My second runner-up is a much, much better book than that. One I wish that I had room on my top 5 list for, and I'm talking about Dan Simmons' The Abominable. I love Dan Simmons. He is probably, gosh, my favorite living author, though he does have a little competition now, as we'll get to on the top 5 list here shortly. But this is a great book. It's not quite as good as something like The Terror or Hyperion, or, you know, he's not at the best here, but he's close. I really, really enjoyed this book. Very glad that I read it. A year where a Dan Simmons novel comes out is always a good year. And unfortunately, there was just 5 other books that I liked better this year. Otherwise, this is very deserving of being on the top 5 list. Okay. Let's get down to business. Number 5. All right, number 5 is where I'm breaking my no rereads rule. And here's why. As I think about the reread rule, what that's primarily for is something like, I used the example of Game of Thrones earlier. Okay, I've read Game of Thrones so many times now. I've watched the series. I know that story. It is a reread in a very pure sense. And then there's some books where it's either been a long time, I don't remember it, or something like that, where, yes, I've technically read it before, but it is such a new experience to me that it feels like it's the first time I'm reading that book. And that was the case with Peter Straub's Blue Rose series, his Timothy Underhill novels. And again, I'm breaking a second rule here by grouping 5 novels together. So Coco, Mystery, The Throat, Lost Boy, Lost Girl, In the Night Room. Now, the reason I'm breaking that rule of grouping those together is because you cannot take one of these novels independently and try and separate it from all the others. I like The Abominable better than any one of these novels individually, but taken as a whole, this series is a masterpiece. It's an exercise in intentional contradiction, the nature of fiction, the nature of evil, of the unreliable narrator. I think what Straub has pulled off in these 5 books in terms of the way that he layers story upon story and detail upon detail, and he'll establish a world so vividly in one novel and then completely contradict it in the next novel, even though they're both part of the same universe. It's something that is difficult to describe, but very much worth experiencing, very much worth reading. Check out my reviews, even if you haven't read the novel. I'm pretty sure I'm spoiler-free. If I'm not, I know that I do try very hard to warn you before I give any spoilers. But his Timothy Underhill novels, start with Coco, work your way forward. They're simply brilliant. It's a masterpiece what he pulled off. And when you step back after you finish the final book and you look at what he's done as a whole, it's simply amazing. It's an absolute masterpiece. So, Peter Straub's Timothy Underhill novels, my number 5 choice for the year. Number 4, well, I ripped on Arthur C. Clarke quite a bit earlier, but here he's going to make the list for Childhood's End, his classic alien invasion sci-fi novel. This was a really, really fascinating book on a number of levels. First of all, it takes all the tropes of alien invasion and throws them right out the window. The aliens come, they take over in the prologue, basically, or within the first 5-10 pages, and they establish world peace. And that's it. They're not there to destroy us. They're not there to harvest our brains. They establish world peace. And what Clarke does from there, as he traces the story over the years and decades and centuries of their rule, is absolutely incredible. Absolutely incredible. I find that his level of detail here, if is very well thought out. If 3001 has his worst tendencies, this is some of its best in terms of giving you a world with scientific concepts and making you think, of forcing you to look at our world as we understand it right now and consider it in a different light. This is Clarke at his absolute best. Not 3001. No, that's not him at his best. Childhood's End, an absolute masterpiece. Okay, number three. Number three is going to be a recent one that I just finished a couple weeks ago. A Canticle for Leibowitz by Walter M. Miller. Another classic sci-fi novel. I tried to read this one once before, a number of years ago, and for whatever reason just didn't get through it. And I'm glad, because I'm glad that I read it now. I read this book now as a Catholic, as somebody who came into the church this last year, and it resonated with me in a much more profound way because of that. And that's not to say that it's a Catholic-only book or anything like that. I have some friends who are Protestants who've really enjoyed it. Clearly it has a wider appeal in terms of being considered a sci-fi classic, even within the secular world. But Canticle for Leibowitz, again, similar to Childhood's End in this sense, in the way that it explores a world over centuries, over years. We see the cycles of history. We see the nature of the church and the state, and it's a brilliant novel. Whether it's about the past or about the future or about both all at once is up for you to decide. But if you haven't read this book and you want a sci-fi novel that's going to make you think, this is it. Simply a masterpiece. Absolutely one of the great sci-fi novels ever written. And like I said, 2013 was a good year for books, and the fact that this is coming in at number 3 should tell you why. What I mean by that, because there's at least 2 books that I liked even more than Canticle for Leibowitz, but it was an absolute masterpiece. Loved it. Okay, my number 2. The only book on my top 5 list that was actually published in 2013, The Ocean at the End of the Lane by Neil Gaiman. Anytime a Neil Gaiman novel comes out, it's an absolute treat. I love Neil Gaiman. I love the way he thinks. I love the way he looks at the world. I love the world that he invites us into when he reads his books. And what he's done here with Ocean at the End of the Lane is particularly brilliant because he's written a book about children and about childhood for adults. And that's difficult to do. He's somehow captured the essence of childhood in this book and made it accessible for adults, if that makes sense. It's a short read, appropriately so, because I think that he got some flack for that, oh, this is so short or whatever. No, I mean, again, it's a children's book that's not for children. It's a book about childhood for adults, about what it means to be a child, about what it means to experience the wider world. It's I guess you could call it a coming-of-age story in some ways, but it's really so much more than that. It's more about what we lose when we become adults, the quest to recapture that. It's a complex view of childhood. As I mentioned in my review for this, and I actually did 2 videos on this because I reread this one. That's how good this was. I read it twice this year and recorded some additional thoughts after my second reading. I mentioned in those videos that this isn't, it's more complex than just adults bad, kids good. No, this is a very thoughtful book. It's a very emotional book. And it's a great read too, in terms of the story that he's telling. It's Neil Gaiman at his absolute finest. It feels like the novel that his whole career has been moving towards. Is it as epic and grand in scope as American Gods? No. Is it as funny as Anansi Boys? No. Is it as cool and gritty as Neverwhere? No. But is it an intimate, powerful read that's even better than all of those? Yes, it is. And those are 3 great books. So that's my number 2 read of the year. All right. Drum roll. Number 1 for me in 2013. I'm going to cheat just a little bit here, but not as much as I did with the Peter Straub one. My number 1 read is the works of Neil Stephenson. Now, I am going to narrow this down a little bit, okay, because not everything that I read by him was top 5 material, but in particular, Cryptonomicon and Anathem, and if I have to choose just one, I'm going to go with Anathem. I had only read Snow Crash prior to this year, and then finally decided it was time to give him another shot. And I started with Anathem, and it blew me away. I think that is one of the best sci-fi novels I've ever read. Cryptonomicon is great too. It will make your brain explode. I'm working my way through the Baroque cycle right now, which makes Cryptonomicon look like a children's novel in terms of complexity. He's a great writer. You know, I read Diamond Age, ReMD, Snow Crash, reread Snow Crash this year, and enjoyed all of them. But the top, the cream of the crop is by far Cryptonomicon and Anathem. I think most people would probably put Cryptonomicon at the top. For me, going back to some of what I talked about with Canticle of Leibowitz, the fact that I became a Catholic this year, at the time I read Anathem, I was working on my second master's degree at a Catholic university that is at an abbey, so I was not in a monastic environment, but studying in a place that had a very monastic quality to it. So I was fascinated by this kind of blending of monasticism and science fiction. I think that when I think about what I want science fiction to be, it's books like this. It's books that challenge me to think. I find it very sad that so much of genre fiction has become about explosions and guns and action and adrenaline and all that. You can have those things be elements of a science fiction story. Indeed, they're elements of these stories, Cryptonomicon and Anathem. But at their heart, these are stories about ideas and the people wrestling with those ideas. And that's what science fiction is. That's why, you know, part of the reason I'm so much more positive on my book reviews than I tend to be on the podcast when I'm, you know, because we tend to talk more about movies and TV shows on the podcast, is because what's being put out there, by and large, is not science fiction in its true sense. It's not true storytelling. It doesn't make you think what's being put out there in movies and TV. Now, there's some exceptions, of course. I don't want to paint with too broad of a brush, you know, but this recent Hobbit movie is a perfect example of just something that, rather than being intelligent, chooses to try and distract us with loud noises and lots of CGI. And that's not science fiction. That's not fantasy. It's not the study of ideas. And to me, that's what science fiction is the exploration of ideas in a novelized form that makes us think about our world and the future differently, that makes us imagine in different ways, that teaches, that challenges us to think about what could be fundamentally differently or what was fundamentally differently. And you will find no better example of that than these two books, Cryptonomicon and Anathem. They are masterpieces among masterpieces. They are some of the greatest books I've ever read, and I look forward to rereading them again and again. We'll see how many times I can get to it in one lifetime, because they are very, very long. But what Neil Stephenson has done with those two books in particular is not only written near perfect novels, but shown us what science fiction can be. And the fact that they're recent novels, I think, is important, because the problem of losing science fiction in its essence, losing it to, you know, Transformers 67 or whatever the next sequel is going to be, and having that be labeled science fiction, is a recent problem, or at least a more major problem. in recent years. And so to be able to have somebody like Neil Stephenson working in the genre today, showing us how to write, how to think, how to tell meaningful stories with great characters, you can't ask for anything better than that. It's a gift to science fiction and a gift to all of us who are willing to turn our brains on and actually think as we enjoy something. These are books, really all 5 of these, but especially this top choice, Anathema and Cryptonomicon. They remind me why I love to read. They reminded me why I love books, why I love science fiction, and why it's not only a source of pleasure, but also something I find worthwhile to think about these ideas, to think about novels, to think about science fiction, to think about the genre, why it's worth a while to do these reviews, to do the podcast, because there are ideas that are worth exploring within the science fiction genre, and getting those ideas out there is a noble enterprise. And Neil Stephenson in these 2 books has captured that brilliantly. So, top 5 reads. Peter Straub's Timothy Underhill novels. Childhood's End by Arthur C. Clarke. Canticle for Leibowitz by Walter M. Miller. Ocean at the End of the Lane by Neil Stephenson. And then Anathema, and if I can slip one other one in there, we'll call it 1.5. Cryptonomicon and Anathema by Neil Stephenson. Been a great 2013. I've loved doing these reviews for you guys. Keep watching. I'm going to keep reading and recording, and I will talk to you next year in 2014. But for now, Sci-Fi Christian Book Reviews, and I'm Ben DeBono. Goodbye.